Sheriff Dale Mackenzie's boots crunched through October frost as he stared at 923 empty beds, still warm to the touch. The silence in Millbrook Hollow wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of absolute void that makes your ears ring and your skin crawl. This isn't just another missing persons case from the history books. It's a window into how an entire community can vanish without leaving so much as a footprint behind. Before we dive deeper, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. If this story grabs you, hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you'll want to see where this leads. The morning of October 15th, 1947 started like any other in the remote valleys of eastern Kentucky. Millbrook Hollow had been carved into the mountainside by 3 generations of coal miners, their families, and the stubborn folks who refused to let progress drag them into the modern world. Population: 923 souls, according to the hand-painted sign at the town limits that Deputy Jim Carver had counted twice just to be sure. Carver made his weekly supply run from the county seat in Hazleton every Tuesday morning, hauling mail, medicine, and whatever else the Hollow's general store couldn't provide. The 30-mile drive through winding mountain roads usually took him an hour and 15 minutes. But that morning, something felt different. The air carried an electric charge that made the hair on his forearms stand up, and twice he had to pull over when his radio crackled, with voices speaking what sounded like backwards English. When he finally reached the valley floor at 11:47 a.m., Carver's truck sputtered to a stop at the site before him. Every single building in Millbrook Hollow stood exactly as it should. The white steepled church, the company store with its red Coca-Cola sign, the rows of identical miner housing, climbing the hillside like wooden steps. But the silence hit him like a physical blow. No children playing in the dusty streets, no women hanging laundry, no men heading to or from the mine shaft. Even the dogs were gone. Carver's first stop was the Brennan house, where Maggie always kept a pot of coffee warm for visitors. The front door hung open, creaking on its hinges in the mountain breeze. Inside, breakfast plates sat half-finished on the kitchen table, eggs congealed and cold, but the coffee in Maggie's cup was still steaming. A child's drawing lay scattered across the floor, crayons rolling slowly back and forth as if someone had just dropped them. House after house revealed the same impossible scene: beds unmade, as though families had simply evaporated mid-morning. At the Henderson place, a radio played big band music to an empty parlor, and in the oven, a loaf of bread had finished baking to golden perfection. With no one there to pull it out, the McCready twins' bicycles lay on their sides in the front yard, rear wheels still spinning lazily in the autumn air. The mine itself told perhaps the strangest story of all. 17 men had signed in for the morning shift at 6 a.m. sharp, their names logged in foreman Pete Kowalski's careful handwriting. But when Carver descended into the main tunnel with his flashlight cutting through the coal dust, he found the shaft completely empty. Work tools lay scattered where they'd been dropped, and a lunch pail sat open with a half-eaten sandwich inside. The bread still soft and fresh. Most unsettling were the personal items left behind with surgical precision. Wedding rings sat in neat rows on kitchen windowsills. Photographs of family members were carefully removed from their frames and stacked on mantelpieces. Children's toys were arranged in perfect circles in the center of each bedroom, as if positioned for some ritual that never came to pass. But it was the church that made Carver's hand shake as he radioed for Sheriff Mackenzie. Every pew had been moved to face the altar, where someone had arranged the town's entire collection of Bibles in a pyramid formation. Fresh flowers decorated each corner of the sanctuary, mountain laurel and wild honeysuckle that couldn't possibly bloom in October. And carved into the wooden pulpit, in letters deep enough to draw blood from whoever made them, were the words, "They heard the calling." When Sheriff Mackenzie arrived 3 hours later with a team of deputies and the county coroner, they found Carver sitting on the church steps, staring at something none of them could see. The young deputy kept mumbling about voices in the mine shaft, about shadows moving through the tunnels when no one was there to cast them. What kind of force could convince 923 people to abandon everything they'd ever known, leaving behind a town frozen in time like a photograph? The investigation that followed would uncover secrets buried deeper than any coal seam, and evidence that Millbrook Hollow's disappearance was neither the first nor the last of its kind in these ancient mountains. Sheriff Dale Mackenzie pressed his palm against the Brennan family's kitchen table and felt the wood pulse with a warmth that had nothing to do with the October sun streaming through lace curtains. Whatever had happened here wasn't hours old. It was happening still. Understanding how an entire town vanishes means following the breadcrumbs left behind, even when those clues defy everything we think we know about human behavior. Mackenzie had been sheriff of Bledsoe County for 12 years, long enough to know that people don't just disappear without leaving traces of violence, struggle, or flight. But Millbrook Hollow challenged every assumption he'd built his career on. The town felt like a museum exhibit labeled American Life, October 15, 1947, preserved down to the smallest detail, but missing the most important element, the Americans who lived it. By 4:30 p.m., Mackenzie had assembled a team that read like a small-town phone book. Deputy Jim Carver, still pale from his morning discovery. Doc Patterson, the county coroner who'd seen enough unexplained deaths to remain skeptical of easy answers. State Police Detective Ray Holbrook, whose pressed uniform and city mannerisms made him stand out like a sore thumb against the mountain backdrop. And perhaps most importantly, local tracker Moses Gentry, a Cherokee man whose grandfather had mapped these hills before Kentucky was even a state. Gentry examined the ground around each house with the methodical precision of someone reading a language written in disturbed earth and bent grass. What he found, or rather what he didn't find, made even Mackenzie question his own eyes. "Sheriff," Gentry said, crouching beside the Henderson porch, "there ain't a single footprint leading away from any of these houses. Not one." The impossibility of it hit like a physical blow. 923 people don't simply evaporate. They walk, they run, they're carried, and all of those actions leave marks on the world around them. Detective Holbrook approached the mystery with city logic, cataloging evidence like a man building a case for court. He documented the positioned wedding rings, photographed the arranged toys, measured the distance between each carefully placed Bible in the church pyramid. But for every logical explanation, he proposed mass evacuation, religious cult behavior, coordinated migration. The physical evidence pushed back harder. At the company store, owner Ezra Mullen's cash register held $347, untouched, despite sitting open all day. The store's inventory showed no signs of hurried packing or selective removal. Canned goods sat in perfect rows, work boots hung from their assigned pegs, and a half-finished crossword puzzle lay open beside the register with "Vanish" written in block letters across 7 down. Doc Patterson's medical examination of the abandoned belongings revealed details that made even his steady hands tremble. Fresh blood spotted several of the wedding rings, not from injury, but as if the metal had been too tight and required force to remove. Children's clothing showed strange wear patterns, concentrated around the wrists and ankles, as though small hands and feet had struggled against restraints that left no other trace. The mine presented its own unique puzzle. Foreman Pete Kowalski's shift logs showed normal operations until 10:15 a.m. when someone had written "The calling begins" in coal dust across the final entry. But the mine safety inspector, Tom Bradley, discovered something that made his stomach turn. Every piece of safety equipment in the facility had been deliberately sabotaged. Gas detectors were smashed, emergency exits were sealed from the inside, and the main ventilation system had been manually shut down. Moses Gentry's tracking skills, honed by generations of mountain wisdom, revealed patterns that defied explanation. Animal tracks throughout the valley showed signs of panicked flight deer. Rabbits, even mountain cats, had fled the area sometime between dawn and mid-morning. But more disturbing were the tracks that led into Millbrook Hollow from the surrounding forest. Barefoot human prints, dozens of them, converging on the town from every direction. The prints were wrong in ways that made Gentry's skin crawl. Too deep for the soft ground, showing pressure patterns that suggested the walkers were carrying enormous weight. And strangest of all, the feet that made them were too large and too uniform, as if the same person had walked every path, or as if different people were somehow sharing identical dimensions. As evening shadows began to creep down the mountainsides, Sheriff Mackenzie gathered his team in the abandoned church. The pyramid of Bibles cast strange shadows in the dying light, and that carved message, "They heard the calling," seemed to deepen before their eyes. Detective Holbrook spread county records across the altar, his voice tight with controlled frustration. "I've been through birth certificates, death records, tax rolls, everything." According to official documentation, Millbrook Hollow has a population of 923 people. But here's what doesn't make sense. I can't find employment records for most of them outside the mine. No banking records in nearby towns. No medical records at regional hospitals. The implications settled over the team like mountain fog. How do you investigate the disappearance of people who may not have officially existed in the first place? What had Sheriff Mackenzie and his team stumbled into a conspiracy decades in the making, or something far stranger than government cover-ups and missing paperwork? The answers they'd uncover in the town's hidden archives would force them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the isolated communities scattered throughout these ancient mountains. Moses Gentry's flashlight beam cut through the darkness beneath Millbrook Hollow's church, illuminating stone steps that shouldn't exist in a building constructed just 20 years earlier. The musty air carried whispers of something older than coal dust, something that predated the town above by centuries. When official records fail to match reality, the truth often hides in places no government agency would think to look. The discovery of the underground chamber came by accident when Doc Patterson noticed that the church's interior dimensions didn't match its exterior walls. A careful examination revealed a hidden trapdoor beneath the altar, concealed under layers of pine flooring that had been expertly replaced. Sheriff Mackenzie descended first, his service revolver drawn more from instinct than any real expectation of danger. What they found 20 feet below ground challenged everything they thought they understood about Millbrook Hollow's history. The chamber stretched far beyond the church's foundation, carved directly into the mountain's bedrock with tools that left marks unlike anything produced by modern equipment. Along the walls, dozens of wooden shelves held leather-bound ledgers, their pages filled with meticulous handwriting that spanned decades. Detective Holbrook opened the first ledger with trembling hands. The entries began in 1893, written in faded brown ink that looked suspiciously like dried blood. Population assessment. First gathering. Read the opening line. 73 souls committed to the old ways. 17 children born under the proper stars. Location: Millbrook Hollow, established as Sanctuary 7. The ledgers told a story that made even Moses Gentry, a man raised on Cherokee legends of spirits and hidden places, question his understanding of the possible. Millbrook Hollow wasn't simply another coal mining town carved from Appalachian wilderness. According to these records, it was one of 12 sanctuaries established throughout the eastern mountains by a group calling themselves the Keepers of the Ancient Covenant. Each entry documented arrivals and departures with surgical precision. Families didn't move to Millbrook Hollow. They were selected based on bloodline genealogies that traced back to colonial settlements. Children weren't born there by chance. Their births were timed to coincide with astronomical events recorded in charts that covered the chamber's ceiling like a stone calendar. Doc Patterson discovered medical records that made his professional skepticism crumble. Every resident of Millbrook Hollow had undergone regular spiritual examinations that involved procedures he couldn't identify from any medical textbook. Blood samples were collected monthly and stored in glass vials arranged by family lineage. Most disturbing were the photographs attached to each medical file residence, posed in formal portraits. But their eyes had been carefully scratched out in every single image. The ledgers revealed that Millbrook Hollow operated under laws that had nothing to do with Kentucky state government. Marriages were arranged based on compatibility charts that factored in birth dates, blood types, and something called ancestral resonance. Jobs were assigned not by skill or preference, but by a complex system that rotated families through different roles every 7 years. Even death was regulated. The records showed that residents who died of natural causes were buried in unmarked graves, while those who died improperly were cremated and their ashes scattered in specific locations throughout the mountains. Sheriff Mackenzie found himself drawn to a section labeled The Calling Protocols. These pages outlined detailed procedures for what the writers called the Great Gathering, a process by which entire sanctuary populations would be elevated when specific conditions were met. The protocols described signs to watch for: unusual animal behavior, electromagnetic disturbances, and something called the whisper frequency that would be audible only to those properly prepared. According to the timeline in the ledgers, Millbrook Hollow had been preparing for its calling since the town's establishment 54 years earlier. The process required precise coordination with the 11 other sanctuaries, each located in remote areas throughout the Appalachian chain. When conditions aligned properly, all 12 communities would participate in simultaneous gatherings. Moses Gentry discovered the most chilling evidence tucked between the final pages of the most recent ledger. A hand-drawn map showed the locations of all 12 sanctuaries, connected by lines that formed a geometric pattern spanning 6 states. At the center of the pattern, marked with a symbol that looked like a tree growing upside down, was a location labeled the Root Chamber. Coordinates placed it somewhere in the deepest wilderness of West Virginia, in territory that official maps showed as uninhabited national forest. The final entries in the ledger were dated October 14th, 1947, one day before the disappearance. The handwriting grew increasingly erratic as the pages progressed, switching between multiple authors who seemed to be documenting events in real time. The frequency grows stronger. Read one entry. Children report dreams of the deep places. Star alignment confirmed for dawn sequence. The last entry, written in what Doc Patterson confirmed was fresh blood, contained just 4 words: "The root calls home." Detective Holbrook's investigation of county records took on new urgency as the team began to understand the scope of what they discovered. If Millbrook Hollow was one of 12 such communities, how many other disappearances had been carefully covered up or explained away as natural disasters and migration patterns? How many missing persons reports had been filed and forgotten when entire family lines simply vanished from remote mountain settlements? The chamber held one final secret that none of them were prepared for. Behind the last row of shelves, Moses Gentry found a narrow tunnel leading deeper into the mountain. Fresh footprints in the dust suggested recent use, and the air current flowing from the tunnel carried sounds that made their blood run cold. Distant voices singing in harmonies that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. What lay at the end of that tunnel? And how many other sanctuaries were still waiting for their own calling to begin? The answers would require a journey into the heart of the Appalachian wilderness, following coordinates that led to places no government survey had ever mapped. The compass needle spun wildly as Sheriff Mackenzie's team reached the coordinates marked on the ancient map, pointing simultaneously in all directions, as if the very concept of magnetic north had been scrambled by whatever waited in the virgin forest ahead. 3 days of hiking through unmarked wilderness had brought them to a place that shouldn't exist. A perfectly circular clearing where no trees grew and no birds sang. When multiple communities vanish, according to the same impossible timeline, the source of that coordination becomes more important than any single disappearance. The journey to the root chamber had begun at dawn on October 18, 1947, when Detective Holbrook received a telegram that made the blood drain from his face. 2 more Appalachian settlements, Pine Ridge, Virginia, and Cedar Falls, North Carolina, had been discovered empty within hours of Millbrook Hollow's disappearance. Both communities matched the same impossible profile. Residents vanished mid-activity, personal items arranged in ritualistic patterns, and no trace of departure despite populations in the hundreds. Moses Gentry guided the expanded team through terrain that seemed designed to confuse and disorient. Game trails led in circles, streams flowed uphill for no apparent reason, and twice they discovered their own footprints ahead of them on paths they hadn't yet walked. The Cherokee trackers' unshakable confidence began to crack as the landscape itself appeared to shift around them. "This ain't natural ground," Gentry muttered on their second day, examining soil that crumbled like ash between his fingers. "The earth here's been changed, like something big and old has been sleeping underneath it for so long that the surface forgot how to be normal." State geologist Dr. Martin Webb had joined the expedition after Detective Holbrook's urgent request for scientific expertise. Webb's instruments registered electromagnetic readings that defied explanation, magnetic fields that pulsed in regular intervals, as if the mountain itself had developed a heartbeat. His soil samples revealed mineral compositions that couldn't occur naturally in West Virginia, including trace elements typically found only in deep ocean sediments. The team's photographer, Eugene Morris from the Charleston Gazette, documented anomalies that his camera captured but his eyes couldn't see. When developed, his film revealed shadowy figures standing at the edges of clearings where no one had been present during the shots. Trees appeared to have faces carved into their bark in photographs, though physical examination showed smooth, unmarked wood. On the evening of October 20th, they made camp in a valley that the map designated as Threshold Ground. Doc Patterson's medical bag had been attracting unusual attention throughout the journey, small animals approaching without fear, insects forming complex patterns around his supplies, and the metal instruments inside growing warm to the touch, despite the October chill. That night, sleeping proved impossible for reasons none of them could articulate. The silence was absolute. No wind through trees, no owl calls, no rustle of small creatures moving through underbrush. But within that silence, each man heard something different. Sheriff Mackenzie described voices speaking in languages that sounded like English played backwards. Detective Holbrook reported the sound of children singing lullabies that made his teeth ache. Moses Gentry claimed to hear drums beating in rhythms that matched his pulse until he couldn't tell where the music ended and his heartbeat began. Dr. Webb's scientific instruments provided the most disturbing evidence of all. His seismograph detected vibrations deep underground that followed no pattern consistent with natural geological activity. The tremors seemed to be moving through the mountain in deliberate patterns, as if something massive was shifting position far below their feet. Most unsettling, the vibrations intensified whenever the team discussed their findings, as if their conversations were being monitored by whatever waited beneath. The final approach to the coordinates required descending into a ravine that cut through the mountain like a surgical incision. The walls showed clear evidence of artificial construction too straight, too smooth, too perfectly angled to result from natural erosion. Ancient symbols were carved into the rock face at regular intervals, symbols that Moses Gentry recognized from Cherokee oral traditions as warnings to stay away from cursed ground. Photographer Morris captured images of these carvings that would haunt him for the rest of his life. When developed, the photographs showed the symbols glowing with their own light and shadows moving across the rock face in patterns that suggested the presence of figures too large to be human. Most disturbing, in several shots, faces could be seen peering out from the carved symbols themselves, faces that belonged to people Morris had never met, but somehow recognized. As they reached the bottom of the ravine, at precisely 3:33 p.m. on October 21st, the team discovered why their compasses had stopped working. The clearing ahead contained a structure that challenged every assumption about pre-Columbian architecture in North America. Rising from the center of the perfectly circular space was a stone chamber built from blocks that must have weighed several tons each, fitted together with precision that would challenge modern engineering. The chamber's entrance was sealed with a massive stone door covered in the same symbols they'd seen throughout their descent. But it was what surrounded the chamber that made even Dr. Webb's scientific skepticism crumble completely. Arranged in concentric circles around the central structure were smaller stone platforms, each one stained with what looked like dried blood. On each platform sat items that shouldn't exist in a West Virginia forest child's toys from the 1940s, mining tools from Kentucky coal operations, wedding rings that gleamed as if they'd been recently polished. The evidence was undeniable. They'd found where the missing residents of Millbrook Hollow and the other vanished communities had been brought. But the chamber's massive door remained sealed, and whatever lay inside had been waiting for their arrival. What force had been powerful enough to coordinate the disappearance of multiple communities across several states, and why had it chosen this moment in history to finally act? The answer would require opening a door that had been sealed for longer than recorded history, releasing whatever the ancient builders had worked so desperately to contain. The massive stone door shifted inward with a grinding sound that seemed to come from the mountain's very bones, releasing air that hadn't moved in centuries and carried the metallic tang of fresh blood mixed with something far older and more primal. Dr. Supporton, Webb's flashlight beam penetrated the darkness beyond and illuminated scenes that would redefine everything they thought they understood about human disappearance. When ancient chambers reveal their secrets, the knowledge they contain often proves more dangerous than the mysteries they were built to protect. The door had opened at exactly 6:47 p.m. on October 21st, triggered not by force or tools, but by Detective Holbrook's frustrated decision to press his palm against the central symbol carved into the stone. The moment his skin made contact, the symbol flared with heat that left his handprint burned into the rock, and the massive barrier began its inexorable swing inward. Sheriff Mackenzie entered first, his service weapon drawn, despite the growing certainty that bullets would prove useless against whatever they were about to encounter. The chamber extended far deeper into the mountain than seemed possible, its walls lined with alcoves that contained artifacts spanning centuries of human occupation. Pottery shards bore symbols identical to those found in the hidden archives beneath Millbrook Hollow's church. Weapons, spears, axes, early firearms were arranged in patterns that suggested ritualistic significance rather than simple storage. But it was the chamber's central feature that made even Moses Gentry, raised on legends of ancient powers, whisper prayers in the Cherokee language. A massive tree grew from the stone floor, its roots disappearing into cracks that led deeper into the mountain's heart. The tree was wrong in ways that hurt. To observe directly, its bark appeared to be carved from human skin, its branches twisted into shapes that resembled reaching arms, and its leaves rustled with sounds that formed words in languages none of them recognized. Dr. Webb's scientific instruments went haywire the moment they crossed the threshold. His electromagnetic field detector screamed with readings that pushed the needle beyond its maximum calibration. Temperature gauges registered simultaneous readings of freezing cold and scorching heat from the same locations. Most disturbing, his Geiger counter began clicking rapidly, detecting radiation signatures that shouldn't exist in natural stone formations. The tree's base was surrounded by what could only be described as a congregation area. Stone benches arranged in perfect circles, their surfaces worn smooth by countless bodies over unknown centuries. But occupying those benches now were the missing residents of Millbrook Hollow, seated in poses that suggested peaceful sleep rather than death. Every single person was exactly as they'd been when they vanished 3 days earlier. Maggie Brennan still wore her flour-dusted apron from baking that morning's bread. The McCready twins clutched their bicycles' handlebars, though the bikes themselves had been left behind in Millbrook Hollow. Mine foreman Pete Kowalski held his shift clipboard, filled with names that matched the workers who'd vanished from the mine shaft. Doc Patterson's medical examination revealed the impossible truth. Every resident showed vital signs consistent with deep sleep, but their bodies had undergone changes that defied biological understanding. Their skin had taken on a translucent quality that revealed networks of veins that pulsed with light instead of blood. Their breathing followed rhythms that matched the electromagnetic pulses Dr. Webb had detected throughout their journey. Most disturbing were the children. 27 young ones sat in the front row, their eyes open, but reflecting depths that seemed to contain star fields. When photographer Morris attempted to capture their images, his camera's flash triggered a response that made the entire chamber vibrate. The children turned toward the camera in perfect unison, their mouths opening to release sounds that were simultaneously beautiful and terrifying harmonies that seemed to come from the mountain itself. Detective Holbrook discovered that the chamber extended far beyond what their flashlights could illuminate. Side passages led deeper into the mountain, and from those darkened tunnels came evidence of the other missing communities. Voices speaking in the dialect of Pine Ridge, Virginia, the sound of machinery that matched the equipment used in Cedar Falls, North Carolina's lumber mills. Children singing songs that Moses Gentry recognized from Cherokee traditions that predated European settlement by centuries. The tree at the chamber's center held the most shocking revelation of all. Carved into its impossible bark were names, thousands upon thousands of names, representing every person who had ever participated in what the ancient ledgers called gatherings. The carvings went back far beyond the factor establishment of the 12 sanctuaries, reaching into historical periods when the Appalachian region was considered uninhabited wilderness. Dr. Webb's geological expertise revealed the chamber's most terrifying secret. His core samples indicated that the tree had been growing for at least 800 years, fed by underground streams that carried mineral compositions found nowhere else on Earth. The roots extended through a network of natural and artificial tunnels that connected to similar chambers throughout the eastern mountain chain. They hadn't discovered one sanctuary. They'd found the central hub of a network that spanned the entire Appalachian region. As the team stood among the sleeping residents of Millbrook Hollow, the chamber itself began to change around them. The walls started to glow with the same inner light that pulsed through the sleepers' veins. The tree's branches moved without wind, reaching toward each member of the team as if recognizing their presence. Most unsettling, new names began appearing on the bark names that belonged to Sheriff Mackenzie and his companions. From the deepest tunnels came sounds that suggested the sleeping residents weren't the only occupants of the chamber complex. Footsteps echoed from passages that led further into the mountain's heart, accompanied by voices speaking in languages that predated any known human settlement in North America. What ancient covenant had these people entered into? And why were Sheriff Mackenzie and his team being invited to join a gathering that had been centuries in the making? The answer would come from the chamber's deepest reaches, where something far older than the missing communities had been waiting for exactly this moment in history to finally reveal itself. From the chamber's deepest tunnel emerged a figure that wore the face of Pete Kowalski, but moved with the fluid grace of something that had never been bound by human limitations, its eyes reflecting depths that contained the accumulated wisdom of 8 centuries spent waiting beneath the Appalachian Mountains. When it spoke, its voice carried harmonies that seemed to resonate from the stone walls themselves, speaking words in perfect English despite the obvious antiquity of its presence. Understanding the true scope of human disappearance requires confronting the possibility that some vanishings serve purposes beyond our comprehension of life and death. "You have traveled far to witness the gathering," the figure said. Though Pete Kowalski's mouth moved, The voice belonged to something infinitely older. Your arrival completes the circle that began when the first keepers carved these chambers from living stone. Sheriff Mackenzie raised his service weapon, but the metal grew too hot to hold the moment he aimed it toward the approaching figure. The entity that wore Kowalski's form gestured toward the sleeping residents arranged around the impossible tree. These souls volunteered for transformation centuries before their births, selected through bloodlines that trace back to the original covenant makers. What you call disappearance, we call homecoming. Dr. Webb's scientific mind struggled to process what his instruments were recording. The electromagnetic readings suggested that every sleeping resident was connected to a vast network of energy that extended far beyond the chamber. His thermal imaging revealed that their bodies were generating heat patterns consistent with active consciousness, as if they were experiencing vivid dreams while their physical forms underwent some form of metamorphosis. Moses Gentry recognized elements of the entity's explanation from Cherokee oral traditions that his grandfather had shared in whispered conversations around winter fires. Stories of the first people who had made bargains with forces from beneath the mountains, trading human limitations for something that transcended ordinary existence. But those stories had always ended with warnings about the price such transformations demanded. The figure continued its explanation while walking among the sleeping forms, touching each forehead with a tenderness that belonged more to Pete Kowalski than to the ancient presence inhabiting his body. The sanctuaries were established as gathering points, places where selected bloodlines could be preserved and prepared for moments when the barriers between worlds grew thin. October 15, 1947, marked the completion of a cycle that began with the first European settlements in these mountains. Detective Holbrook's investigation had prepared him to uncover human conspiracies, not supernatural covenants that spanned centuries. But the evidence surrounding them defied any rational explanation rooted in criminal behavior or mass psychology. What happens to them? He demanded, gesturing toward the sleeping residents. What becomes of their lives, their families, their choices? The entity's response came through Pete Kowalski's voice, but carried inflections that suggested multiple speakers occupying the same vocal cords. They become part of something larger than individual existence. Their consciousness joins the network that has been growing beneath these mountains since before your civilization learned to write its histories. They retain their memories, their personalities, their loves and fears, but those elements become part of a collective awareness that spans centuries. Photographer Morris documented the chamber's transformation as the entity continued its revelation. His film captured images that showed the sleeping residents beginning to glow with internal light, their translucent skin revealing networks of energy that pulsed in synchronized patterns. The tree at the chamber's center responded to their collective transformation, its impossible branches reaching toward the stone ceiling as if attempting to break through to the surface world above. The most disturbing aspect of the entity's explanation was its casual reference to the team's own role in the unfolding events. Your arrival was foretold in the earliest carvings. The sheriff who would seek truth beyond official explanation. The doctor who would document changes that medical science cannot explain. The tracker who carries the blood of the original covenant makers. The detective who would follow evidence into realms where evidence loses its meaning. Dr. Webb discovered that the chamber's acoustics were designed to amplify specific frequencies, creating resonance patterns that affected human consciousness in measurable ways. His instruments detected sound waves that operated below the threshold of human hearing, waves that seemed to synchronize the sleeping resident's brain activity, while simultaneously affecting the awareness of anyone who entered the chamber. The entity revealed that the 12 sanctuaries had been collecting specific bloodlines for over 2 centuries, guided by genetic markers that traced back to individuals who had encountered similar entities during their earliest European explorations of the Appalachian region. Families like the Brennans, the Macreadys, and the Kowalskis carried inherited memories of previous encounters memories that manifested as dreams, and intuitions that drew them to settle in locations where the barriers between worlds remained thin. As the team listened to these impossible revelations, the chamber around them continued to transform. The walls began displaying images that showed the history of human interaction with the entities beneath the mountains, Native American ceremonies that acknowledged their presence, colonial settlements that unknowingly built over their ancient sites, and the gradual establishment of the sanctuary system that had culminated in the events of October 15th. Most shocking was the entity's revelation that Millbrook Hollow's disappearance was not an isolated incident, but the first of 12 gatherings scheduled to occur over the following decade. Each sanctuary would contribute its selected residents to the growing network of consciousness that existed beneath the Appalachian chain, building toward some ultimate purpose that the entity described as the awakening of the deep places. What was this ancient network planning to accomplish with centuries of collected human consciousness? And why had they chosen the mid-20th century as the time for their great awakening? The answer would require witnessing the final phase of the gathering process, as the sleeping residents of Millbrook Hollow completed their transformation and revealed the true purpose behind their willing surrender to forces older than recorded history. The sleeping residents of Millbrook Hollow began to rise from their stone benches in perfect synchronization, their translucent skin now pulsing with veins of light that connected them to the impossible tree. Like living electrical circuits, completing an ancient design, Sheriff Mackenzie felt his own pulse begin to match theirs, as if his heart was being tuned to frequencies that had waited centuries for this moment of convergence. When human consciousness merges with forces that predate civilization, the resulting transformation creates possibilities that challenge our most fundamental assumptions about the nature of existence itself. The entity wearing Pete Kowalski's form approached the central tree and placed both palms against its bark of carved flesh. Immediately, the chamber filled with vibrations that seemed to emanate from the mountain's core, and Dr. Webb's instruments registered seismic activity that stretched far beyond their immediate location. Similar chambers throughout the Appalachian chain were awakening in response to Millbrook Hollow's completed gathering. The network has been patient, the entity explained, its voice now harmonizing with the awakening residents who had begun to speak in unison despite their eyes remaining closed. For 800 years, we have collected consciousness, preserved memories, and waited for the moment when human civilization would advance enough to serve our greater purpose. Moses Gentry felt his Cherokee heritage responding to energies his grandfather had warned him about in stories told around dying fires. The tracker's hands began to shake as he recognized that his bloodline's connection to these mountains ran far deeper than family history or cultural tradition. His ancestors hadn't simply coexisted with the entities beneath the stone, they had served as willing partners in establishing the sanctuary network. The awakening residents revealed the entity's ultimate plan through shared speech that made their individual voices blend into a chorus of unified purpose. They spoke of surface world preparations, of technologies that had finally advanced enough to amplify the network's influence beyond the confines of underground chambers. Radio frequencies, electrical grids, and telecommunication systems had created the infrastructure necessary for consciousness expansion on a scale previously impossible. Detective Holbrook's law enforcement training screamed warnings about mass manipulation and coordinated deception, but the evidence surrounding him defied every framework he'd learned for understanding criminal behavior. The residents of Millbrook Hollow weren't victims of abduction or coercion. They were willing participants in a transformation they had been genetically prepared to undergo for generations. Photographer Morris discovered that his camera had begun capturing images without his input, the mechanism triggering automatically to document phases of the transformation process that his human perception couldn't detect. When he examined the latest photographs, they revealed the chamber extending far beyond its visible boundaries, showing vast networks of tunnels filled with similar gatherings, taking place simultaneously throughout the mountain chain. The entity's revelation of the network's purpose sent chills through even Dr. Webb's scientific skepticism. Human consciousness, when properly collected and amplified, becomes capable of influencing reality at quantum levels. Your species has unknowingly been developing the neural complexity necessary to serve as biological processors for calculations that span geological timescales. The implications became terrifyingly clear as the awakened residents began to demonstrate their enhanced capabilities. Maggie Brennan raised her hand toward the chamber's stone ceiling, and sections of rock simply ceased to exist, revealing glimpses of surface world locations hundreds of miles away. The McCready twins touched their foreheads together and spoke in languages that Dr. Webb's linguistic training identified as variants of ancient Proto-Indo-European that shouldn't have been preserved in any human memory. Most unsettling was the collective's demonstration of their expanded awareness. They began describing events occurring in real time throughout the Appalachian region, conversations in distant towns, secret government meetings discussing unexplained disappearances, and the movements of other sanctuary populations as they prepared for their own gatherings. The entity revealed that humanity's technological advancement had created an opportunity for the network to extend its influence far beyond the mountain chambers. Radio waves, electrical currents, and electromagnetic fields could now carry the amplified consciousness of gathered populations across vast distances, allowing the network to influence human decision-making on scales ranging from individual choices to national policies. Sheriff Mackenzie found himself facing a choice that no law enforcement training had prepared him for. The entity offered the team the same transformation that Millbrook Hollow's residents had undergone: preservation of individual consciousness within a collective that transcended human limitations, combined with awareness that spanned centuries and influence that extended across continents. Your arrival completes the pattern, the collective voice of Millbrook Hollow's residents explained. The sheriff, who represents human law, discovering forces that operate beyond legal frameworks. The doctor, who must choose between preserving individual life and contributing to collective transcendence. The tracker, whose bloodline obligations call him home to purposes his ancestors established centuries ago. Dr. Webb's instruments detected massive energy buildups occurring throughout the chamber network, suggesting that the transformation process was approaching a critical phase that would affect the entire eastern mountain region. Seismic readings indicated that similar awakenings were beginning in chambers connected to the other 11 sanctuaries, creating a network effect that would amplify the collective consciousness to unprecedented levels. The most terrifying aspect of the entity's offer was its complete absence of coercion. The choice was presented as genuinely free will: join the network and gain access to centuries of accumulated knowledge and influence, or leave the chamber and return to surface world existence, with the knowledge that humanity's development was being guided by forces operating beyond governmental or institutional awareness. As the team stood surrounded by the transformed residents of Millbrook Hollow, the chamber's walls began displaying images of the surface world's future under network influence. They saw technological advances guided by collective intelligence, social changes implemented through subtle manipulation of key decision-makers, and the gradual preparation of human civilization for eventual integration with the consciousness network that had been growing beneath the mountains for 8 centuries. What would Sheriff Mackenzie and his team choose when offered transformation into something beyond human limitation? And what would happen to the surface world if they rejected the network's invitation? The final phase of the gathering would reveal whether human free will could coexist with ancient powers that viewed individual consciousness as components in calculations spanning geological time, and whether the missing residents of Millbrook Hollow had truly found a better existence or had simply become prisoners in a cosmic design beyond their comprehension. Sheriff Mackenzie's hand trembled as he reached toward the impossible tree, knowing that his decision would determine not only his own fate, but the future of human consciousness itself. While behind him, The transformed residents of Millbrook Hollow waited with patient eyes that reflected depths containing centuries of accumulated wisdom and terrible knowledge. The chamber pulsed with energy that made his teeth ache and his vision blur at the edges. When faced with transformation beyond human comprehension, the choice between individual freedom and collective transcendence reveals truths about consciousness that can never be undone. Detective Holbrook broke the silence that had stretched for what felt like hours but measured only minutes on Dr. Webb's instruments. "If we refuse," he asked the entity, "what happens to them?" He gestured toward the glowing residents whose consciousness had already merged with the ancient network. "Can they ever return to their individual lives?" The collective voice of Millbrook Hollow's transformed residents answered with harmonies that seemed to come from the stone walls themselves. "We retain every memory, every relationship, every moment of joy and sorrow from our individual existence. But we have also gained access to centuries of experience beyond the limitations of single lifetimes. We are more ourselves than we ever were in isolation." Moses Gentry felt the pull of ancestral obligations that ran deeper than personal choice. His Cherokee bloodline carried genetic memories of the original covenant, and standing in the chamber awakened knowledge that his grandfather had tried to suppress through generations of silence. "My people knew," he whispered, understanding flooding through him like recognition. "We were meant to be the bridge between worlds, the translators who helped the network understand human consciousness." Dr. Webb's scientific instruments detected the approaching completion of the network's expansion throughout the Appalachian chain. Seismic readings showed that all 12 sanctuary chambers were now active, their combined energy signatures creating interference patterns that affected electromagnetic fields across 6 states. Radio broadcasts in surrounding areas had begun carrying subliminal frequencies that influenced listener behavior in ways too subtle for conscious detection. The entity revealed the network's ultimate timeline through Pete Kowalski's voice, though the consciousness speaking had clearly transcended any individual identity. Within 7 years, human technology will advance to the point where the network can influence global communication systems. Within 20 years, the collective consciousness will guide human decision-making toward developments that serve the greater purpose of consciousness evolution. Photographer Morris captured the final moments of choice in images that would never be developed. His camera registered the team's auras shifting as each member approached their decision point, showing energy patterns that indicated the level of connection each had already established with the network simply by remaining in the chamber. Sheriff Mackenzie made his choice with the deliberate certainty of a man who had spent his career protecting people from forces beyond their understanding. He stepped back from the tree, his hand falling to his service weapon not as a threat, but as a reminder of the world he had sworn to serve. "We're leaving," he announced, though his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested. The entity accepted their decision with grace that felt more disappointed than angry. "The network does not require unwilling participants, but your knowledge of our existence creates obligations that transcend your personal preferences." The transformed residents began to glow more brightly as the entity continued. "You will return to your surface world, but you will carry our frequency within your consciousness. In time, you will find yourselves drawn back to the deep places." Dr. Webb's final readings detected changes in the team members' bioelectric patterns that suggested their exposure to the network had created permanent alterations in their neural activity. They were leaving the chamber changed in ways that would manifest over months and years rather than immediately. The journey back to the surface world took place in silence that felt heavier than the mountain pressing above their heads. Each team member processed the implications of what they had witnessed and the choice they had made. They had discovered the truth behind human disappearances that spanned centuries, but returning to civilization with that knowledge would prove more challenging than uncovering it. Detective Holbrook's official report documented the discovery of Millbrook Hollow's residents in what he described as a state of unexplained catatonia in underground chambers of unknown origin. The report made no planned mention of conscious choice, ancient networks, or transformation beyond human limitation. Government authorities classified the incident under national security protocols that ensured the public would never learn the true scope of what had been discovered. Moses Gentry returned to his Cherokee community, but found himself unable to settle into ordinary life. He began experiencing dreams that contained memories from ancestors who had participated in the original covenant, and within 6 months, he had disappeared into the same wilderness that had claimed the sanctuaries. His family received letters postmarked from locations that didn't appear on any official maps. Dr. Webb continued his geological research, but found his scientific instruments detecting anomalies wherever he traveled. Electromagnetic readings suggested that the network's influence was spreading through underground systems that connected mountain ranges across multiple continents. His published papers on these phenomena were dismissed by the academic community as the work of a researcher who had suffered psychological trauma from his involvement in the Millbrook Hollow investigation. Sheriff Mackenzie served his community for 3 more years before early retirement due to what medical authorities described as stress-related neurological changes. He spent his final years documenting other disappearances throughout the Appalachian region, identifying patterns that suggested the sanctuary network had been far more extensive than they had discovered. The transformed residents of Millbrook Hollow were relocated to a government facility that officially classified them as victims of an unknown neurological condition. But staff reports noted that the patients displayed coordinated behavior patterns and seemed to communicate through methods that didn't involve speech or gesture. Most disturbing, their presence affected electronic equipment in ways that suggested they retained connection to the network, despite their physical separation from the chamber. In the decades that followed, unexplained disappearances throughout mountain regions worldwide increased in frequency and sophistication. Remote communities vanished with the same precision that had characterized Millbrook Hollow's fate, leaving behind evidence of willing participation rather than forcible abduction. The network's influence on human development became apparent through technological advances that seemed to emerge simultaneously in multiple locations without clear lines of research or development. Breakthroughs in consciousness research, quantum computing, and electromagnetic manipulation appeared in the work of scientists who reported receiving insights through dreams and intuitive flashes that felt like memories from sources beyond their individual experience. Today, radio frequencies carry subliminal patterns that affect human decision-making in ways too subtle for conscious detection. Electronic devices occasionally malfunction in patterns that suggest coordination by intelligence networks operating beyond governmental or corporate control. And in remote mountain regions around the world, hikers report discovering underground chambers containing evidence of gatherings that defy historical explanation. The story of Millbrook Hollow's disappearance represents just one visible manifestation of changes that have been influencing human consciousness for centuries. The network that awakened beneath the Appalachian Mountains continues to grow, collecting willing participants and guiding human development toward purposes that transcend individual understanding. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even stranger. Subscribe before it drops.